The quiet murmur of discussions in the bar was occasionally broken up by the clink of glasses, but it wasn't the type of location that anyone would go to because of its allure. This was a crossroads for travelers, an interplanetary melting pot and a place to relax for people with tales they wouldn't share with the bartender. A person used calm hands to wipe down the surface, practicing his moves and purposeful. His stance was easy, his face was unreadable, yet his eyes didn't notice anything. As the doors hissed open and a squad of extraterrestrial guards strode in, their tall figures in the Galaxy standard-issue armor created long shadows in the darkened room. Their presence demanded attention, and the police officer's insignia shone in the flickering lights. As the conversation subsided to a tense murmur, the guards' assurance gave way to conceit as they looked around the room. One of the tallest of them made a foul sound as his eyes fell on the bartender. Sound echoed throughout the space until a human voice could be heard clearly. They allowed one of these delicate... The bartender didn't laugh, but the others did, their booming voices resonating off the metal walls. He moved from one end of the counter to the other while cleaning, reacting as though the remark hadn't been made at first. He remained silent, which just seemed to make them laugh more. "Hey, man," another guard shouted, "don't ignore us," and slammed a hand on the counter. "Tell me how it feels good to serve those who are far better than you." The bartender put down the glass and glanced up, his face composed and free of expression. His voice steadied the lead guard as he inquired, "Any emotion, what can I get for you?" He said to his friends, attempting to seem all smug, "Look at him, professional. I'm sure he's terrified that the bartender didn't respond. Just grabbed a bottle and started pouring a drink for a different customer." There was a long pause, but it wasn't. The guards started to shuffle, their laughing wavering as their attempts to tease him made him uneasy. The human belled guard barked and leaned closer, but he fell flat when I asked him. The bartender hesitated. "Feel small, weak. We could crush you with a single blow." He turned back to the guards after setting the drink in front of a customer, briefly locking eyes with the leaders. The alien hesitated because there was something inscrutable in his eyes, but it vanished in an instant. Immediately substituted with the same neutral phrase, "Drink or leave the bartender." Stated in a stern but non-aggressive tone, and the leader grinned back. Didn't make it to his eyes this time, but he said, "You've got guts, I'll give you that. When someone decides you're no longer funny, courage won't save you." The guards found this funny enough to laugh again. The bartender ignored them as they proceeded to make fun of him, their voices louder than before, and the customers at nearby tables exchanged nervous looks, with most avoiding eye contact with the guards and instead concentrating on their beverages or appearing to be absorbed in their thoughts. But some couldn't resist glancing at the bartender, their faces displaying a mixture of functional skills and complexity on what made us more intimidating than just the bartender's composure. They were also intrigued and uneasy. His movements were regulated and efficient, with no wasted motion. Although subtle, their presence seemed to permeate the space in a way that people who frequently visited didn't immediately notice. The bar had previously observed it, but now that the alien guards were watching, it was hard to overlook one customer. An elderly extraterrestrial with grayish skin and several eyes leaned in the direction of his buddy. He didn't appear very whispered, but he seemed to have caught a glimpse of the companions. Nodded but remained silent because there was a lot of tension in the room and nobody wanted to attract the guards' notice. The guards' laughter subsided as they moved away from the bartender and into their chairs, but their gazes stayed focused. They ordered drinks from the bartender, but they weren't finished with him yet. Stories of wars fought, foes vanquished, and planets tamed were carried as they talked about their accomplishments. Space, as though they had to remind themselves and everyone else of their former superpowers. One of the power people claimed that smearing is always the first to lose a battle. You would think that by now they would have realized that it would be better for them to remain on that tiny rock of theirs, the bartender. As he refilled their glasses, the The lead guard leaned in once more to ask, how did someone like you find out here helping people like us? That's your story, human. The bartender didn't immediately respond. After pouring, he put the bottle down and looked at the guard. He spoke the words quiet, and the guard's harsh laughter filled the room with silence. Bolito repeatedly shook his head, indicating that people prefer silence. Perhaps that's because they have nothing worthwhile to say. So the bartender turned them away and moved on to the next customers. Nor did he seem surprised or uneasy when they turned away from him. His silence at the other end of the counter wasn't fearful, and those who were paying close attention realized that something different was wrong. He was purposeful in avoiding any interaction with the guards that suggested restriction rather than submission. But the leader saw it as weakness and loomed over you think you're better than us? He demanded, slamming his hand down and making the glasses rattle. You believe you're too skilled to respond to our inquiries? The bartender gave him a calm gaze, and his eyes seemed solid. When he stated, "You've had enough," the room fell silent, and the other customers froze their fun. For a minute, the leader's smirk vanished and was replaced with a frown as eyes darted between the bartender and the guard. Appeared as though he may relax, but then he moved closer and growled softly, saying, "You've got a death wish, human." The bartender just stood there with his hands without flinching or backing away. His posture was comfortable as he rested on the counter. It wasn't defiance, acquiescence, but there was something completely different that caused the guard to hesitate. The quiet was thick and harsh. The other guards moved around in their chairs, their glee and bluster forgotten. Even the customers who had been... It was unsettling to openly stare at the bartender's serenity while pretending not to watch, and the guards appeared to notice it for the first time. Without saying anything further, the bartender turned and proceeded to the dresser. He grabbed a glass from the other end of the counter, cleaned it, and went back to his seat. The leader scowled at him for a long time before eventually going back to his seat, acting as though nothing had happened. The tension in the room decreased a little as he muttered under his breath. But it didn't disappear. The bartender didn't, and the guards kept boasting and laughing, but it was quieter now. Glance in their direction once more, but his presence was sufficient. The guards' comments became louder and more obscene as the night wore on, yet the guards' prior haughtiness had been replaced by the bartender's calm, steady manner, changed to something more like to uneasiness. And although no one expressed it out loud, the customers all had the same feelings. I felt that the bartender had more to offer than just myself. His narrative started long ago, and he has always been a man of subtle gestures and reserved words. Once a soldier and fighter, he now named the small tavern his home. As delicate as it appeared, Earth was formed in the crucible of humanity's darkest hours. Threats to the galaxy as a whole had come from outside its environment, necessitating extraordinary measures. He had become well known in this chaos, not voluntarily, but because he had been enlisted at a young age. Taken from a normal existence and thrown into the murky recesses of unofficial military exercises, these were the locations where humanity trained for the unthinkable. The rigorous curriculum was intended to remove his vulnerabilities and create something unbreakable. By the time he finished the training, he was more than just a soldier, a weapon. His missions were classified, and his achievements were not publicly acknowledged. But within the fights he fought weren't the kind that went down in history, but his name was legend among those who cared. Books, the majority of which were alien intrusions that the average public was unaware about. Preemptive strikes to shield Earth from invisible threats in clandestine operations on hostile worlds he was given tasks to complete, while the small groups he oversaw worked in the background, guaranteeing that everyone on Earth may sleep peacefully without being aware of the existential dangers that were only a short distance away. A pivotal moment that solidified his fame and marked the beginning of his decline, missions stood out among the innumerable others. The adversary had been merciless, absolutely technologically sophisticated, and completely unconcerned with the lives they were trying to take. They didn't bargain. Instead, they devoured his team's assigned path. It was thought to be a suicidal mission, with ODS to neutralize a crucial outpost of their operation, but it failed. Wasn't an option, and although the operation was successful, his team didn't. Return? He was the only one who emerged from the inferno victorious, but bruised. It was a burden that never went away, knowing that he had rescued billions, yet lost everything in the process. He felt hollow medals, promotions, and whispers of the praise that followed. Recognition of his unparalleled talent was insignificant in comparison to the expressions of the people he had abandoned for years. Kept serving his name, which was cited as a caution and a guarantee that he became a representation of Earth's tenacity and a reminder that humanity could fight back despite all of its seeming flaws. Fiercely when cornered, but the more he failed in each mission, the greater the price of that reputation became. Triumphed, the more the galaxy noticed, and the more his adversaries wanted to destroy him. It wasn't just the outside threats that plagued him, and the scars he bore were not limited to his physical appearance. The unrelenting demands of his position left no space for peace, and the ghosts of his fallen companions plagued his nights. To doubt whether this cycle would ever come to an end, either the road he had chosen or, more accurately, the path that had been selected for him. Of violence, could a weapon ever just stop being a weapon? The tipping point occurred on what was meant to be his last mission, which was the result of everything he had been. This time, the opponent he was training for was not like any he had encountered previously. The mission was meticulously calculated and aimed at making an example of him. Accomplished, but the fallout was disastrous, with innocent people killed in the ensuing response. Collateral damage that was more burdensome to him than any loss he had previously experienced. And it was at that point that he recognized that his efforts were in vain because he eliminated every threat. So, as the cycle would start anew, and he would rise. The cycle would start anew, and he formally vanished after that. Although many people thought he was dead, he was classified as retired. The galaxy whispered his name in equal parts veneration and fear, but he abandoned that life and looked for solitude, a location where he possibly survived without the allure of duty. The bar, which is tucked away in a little-known area of a busy interstellar hub, became his haven, a place where he could fade and no one knew about his background. Fading into the background and remaining there, yet even in this case, his history managed to catch the wounds on his body, the manner in which he carried himself, and the unsaid. Customers came and went, some curious, some frightened, but most were aware of his confidence in every move, unaware of the past that was behind the counter, quietly and efficiently serving drinks. But he stayed away from fragments of his past are discussed, and they are evident in the way he handled some circumstances. An argument while intoxicated would stop before it started. With just one look from him, the trouble that appeared imminent would vanish beneath the sky. Those who listened started to piece together the story under the weight of his composed, steady presence, but none could understand the whole truth. He didn't have to tell them. His quiet was sufficient. He kept the intensity of the battle that was still raging inside of him, the expressions of his teammates, and the cries of his participants. And when the cries died down, he had left the battlefield, but the weight of the innocent people he had killed remained with him. Every night when the pub closed, and he stood by himself amid the soft buzz of the lights, he felt as though the battlefield had not abandoned him. The memories he couldn't shake, the pull of the past, and the realization that no matter how far he ran, he remained at the bar, even though he will always be the deadliest warrior on Earth. A form of comfort that he had not been able to find elsewhere, and he wasn't a soldier or a hero, he was merely a man who poured drinks. Every night when the pub closed, and he stood by himself amid the soft buzz of the lights, he felt as though the battlefield had not abandoned him. The memories he couldn't shake, the pull of the past, and the realization that no matter how far he ran, he remained at the bar even though he will always be the deadliest warrior on earth. A form of comfort that he had not been able to find elsewhere, and he wasn't a soldier or a hero, he was merely a man who poured drinks, listened to tales, and maintained the tranquility in his own small way, but it wasn't the life he had previously dreamed of. However, that was sufficient for the time being. The ambiance of the room changed as the loud shouts of the alien guards filled the pub as they continued to drink and harass, started to get a sharper edge after initially appearing innocuous. The leader was encouraged by the players before high-fiving them as his friends laughed. He returned his focus to the bartender, whom the previous encounter had bruised. Wounded ego, which he was resolved to mend by claiming his authority over him. It was difficult for people to respond, and he wasn't the type of person or animal to overlook difficulties. Guards started acting more aggressively, slamming their drinks and transforming their taunts into outright threats. Harder threw wine carelessly across the counter and publicly chastised the bartender for remaining silent while cowardice. The lead guard sat back in his chair and made loud statements about how weak people are. Each word in his claims about the power of his own species was meant to convey stories of their inadequacy, try to elicit a response, but no one approached. And customers watched with increasing discomfort. They were aware of the growing hostility between the bartender and the guards, as well as the composed manner in which he found their provocations disturbing. And some whispered to one another why the bartender didn't defend himself. Others discreetly moved away from the chaos, more visibly, fearing that they would be collateral if things took a worsen. But there was no denying that the bartender's cow wasn't born of obedience, but something more purposeful. The guards became louder, and their intimidation tactics more obvious. The leader chose to vent his annoyance on another customer as the bartender kept avoiding their bait. Somewhere, the unfortunate extraterrestrial, a mildly anxious being who had been diligently imprisoning himself in his own home, lifted his eyelashes and looked over at the guards, who was drawn into the spotlight, where the guards started making fun of him, knocking over his drink, and the gathering fell silent as they laughed at his weak protests, and the atmosphere became tense with anxiety and discomfort. The bartender remained behind the counter, watching but remaining motionless as the leader's taunting intensified, and he seized the alien by the arm, raised him with ease, and pretended to doubt his value. Was the type of display that told the other patrons of the pub that they were under the guards and that they were there. The alien's struggles were feeble, and their protests could hardly be heard over the guards' laughter. And when the bartender finally spoke, his tone was composed but forceful, slicing through the cacophony like a blade. He instructed the guards to cease speaking in a way that left no possibility of interpretation. When the laughter stopped, the leader returned his focus to the counter, his face showing a mixture of surprise and annoyance. The crowd held its breath for a moment, and nobody moved to see how. The leader's pride was obviously injured, and the guards would react by sneering, wanted to know the bartender's plan of action, bringing his challenge to bear with all the weight of his authority. His friends started to taunt him after noticing the brewing dispute. The leader rose from his seat, towering over everyone, eager to demonstrate his supremacy. The counter moved near to the bartender, threatening him in a way that made it clear what he intended to do. Didn't flinch as he faced the leader's unwavering gaze and reiterated his. The guards looked at one another, a glimmer of doubt flickering between. Something about the bartender's cow's steady voice made them uneasy. However, the leader refused to concede in front of his fellows, dismissed it with a chuckle, and proceeded to worsen the situation by pushing the bartender. The apprehensive customer pushed the smaller aliens away, causing them to sprawl, and focused entirely on the bartender. The guards, emboldened by their leader's bluster, prepared for conflict when the chamber reached a breaking point. The customer retreated, not wanting to be caught in the crossfire with everyone watching. The bartender is now awaiting his reaction, his calmness, and his lack of fear. Manner and his subdued cautions had prepared the ground, but the leader's taunts would define the confrontation. Rincewind became more vocal, made his threats more clear, and insisted that the bartender asked him to explain why he believed he had the authority to criticize the Galactic Enforcement Corps. Instead of falling for the ruse, the bartender maintained his composure and authoritative demeanor. It was a subdued display of power that only those who were closely observing could understand without being unduly combative. Completely understand the guard's growing impatience and the leader's lack of satisfaction to rely on words, he lifted his hand with the intention of using force to make his point. As he made his goal apparent, the crowd held its collective breath, but before his impact could cause something to shift, changing the air in a subtle, changing expression, all seemed to intensify in an instant. Determined that the majority of customers hardly noticed that the leader's attack had been halted before it could start, his wrist caught in mid-stride with flawless precision, and the audience exploded in quiet. The bartender, remaining serene and calm, maintained eye contact with the soldier while maintaining a firm but not forceful. But it wasn't a display of power. Rather, it served as a reminder of who was actually in charge at the time. The leader was taken by surprise and attempted to pull away, but the bartender held on to him. The commander froze his confidence and gave one last warning, his voice as serene as ever, but with an unmistakable weight. Realizing that he had misjudged the man in front of him, he broke down in front of his cheering buddies. He and the customers had exchanged uncomfortable looks just minutes before, and they were silently watching. The bartender released the guard's wrist once their initial anxiety was replaced by wonder and interest. His point was delivered without a word. He went back to work and resumed his responsibilities as though nothing had occurred. A somber silence replaced the leader's earlier bravado as he staggered back to his seat, clearly rattled. Guards, uncertain of what to do next, followed suit, their previous bluster fading. The regular buzz of talk gradually returned to the room, but the tension was still present. Customers muttered to one another, speculating on what they had just seen. The guards were now subdued and avoided. Encountering the bartender's eyes, their previous supremacy was diminished to a mere recollection for the remainder of the meal. The bartender moved as quietly and efficiently as usual that evening, ignoring the whispers or the fleeting looks. He just carried on with his task, his presence serving as a constant reminder that there was a force beneath the humble man pouring drinks that required respect. Without ever having to Despite being temporarily subdued, the guards weren't willing to let their wounded pride go unpunished. Following his unsuccessful attempt to demonstrate his dominion over beings, leader sat in silence, enduring the humiliation that followed. The bartender's composed defiance had been a surprise under his silence, since he was used to commanding dread. The leader could feel his rage building every second one of the guards passed. Leaning over and whispering something to the leader in an effort to save the group's reputation, the words seemed to regain his self-assurance, and he sat up taller, looking at the bartender with a fresh look of resentment in his eyes. Leaving things as they were wasn't enough. They had to make an effort to demonstrate that they were in charge, and their deeply rooted haughtiness deserved revenge. The leader signaled to his followers, and they gathered around the bar. Their strategy was simply use their sheer numbers to subdue the bartender, whom they had previously misidentified. They underestimated him once more because they thought he would break if they put enough pressure on him. The bartender stepped forward. The first guard made a quick and public relations choice that went against their previous decision. His moves were smooth, well thought out, and incredibly powerful. He neutralized the oncoming guard with a single motion, and before he could respond, the guard slumped. The bartender's actions served as a clear reminder to the others that their presumptions were incorrect, leaving them stunned and frozen in shock. The other guards paused, their trust shattered but not completely destroyed, after learning something alarmingly wrong about him. When the leader yelled commands, They hurried forward, thinking that their united might would overcome him, and the bartender's subsequent demonstration of skill put everyone in the room in a state of shock. Simply fighting, he destroyed them with a dexterity that almost seemed natural. Every move was calculated, every blow was purposeful. He exploited their bulk and strength against them in a precise manner, leaving no space for error. One by one, they fell, each guard as they turned their aggression into their demise. Meeting the same end as the first, the customers silently observed, their astonishment mounting with each moment that went by. Second, what they had first written off as a regular guy was now clearly shown to be something much more. The bartender's actions demonstrated years of experience and training, a lifetime dedicated to learning talents that few could understand. The leader's arrogance as the last person standing gazed at the bartender in a mix of fear and wrath, so unwavering a moments earlier, or had completely fallen apart. Yet even with his fear, desperation drove his every action, and he refused to give up. The bartender, determined to recover some control, responded to his attack with the same cool precision. Taking him out as easily as the others, the battle ended as soon as it started and the guards left, immobilized, and there was an almost tangible hush in the room as the bartender. Despite the chaos, he remained unmoved and unharmed, his presence commanding. Gloat merely went back to his job behind the bar and resumed his duties without saying anything of triumph. If nothing had transpired, the customers, still in shock at what they had seen, whispered to one another in low tones. Guards who had so cockily entered the pub now lay defeated, one of them slowly having their reputation destroyed, managed to get up, gripping his wounds, and he glanced at the bartender, his face displaying a mix of fear and wonder. He whispered, "Who are you?" The bartender's query hung thick in the air, didn't respond right away, looking at the guard with an unreadable face. Before responding in a way that was as mysterious as it was final, the leader simply said, "I don't tolerate trouble." He was still having trouble regaining his composure, but he seemed to pick up on something the bartender said, or maybe in his manner. He murmured a name or title beneath his breath, and the other, whatever he stated, had weight, and the guards were plainly startled by the revelation. They exchanged looks. Their previous bluster was replaced by an implicit knowledge that they had gone too far with someone considerably more their understanding. The guards, now completely vanquished, started to flee. As they left the pub, the leader threw one, and they went slowly, their previous confidence completely gone. GL's final look at the bartender showed a mixture of respect and animosity, which he knew well then to push. Additionally, no area of the room was silent, regardless of the force the bartender represented. Even though they were still cautious, the patrons started to unwind once the guards left, the tension of the incident still hanging in the air. As their hushed chatter gradually filled the room, they mentioned the bartender in reverent tones. His curiosity about who he really is now more intense than ever, but provided no new information, his attitude remained the same and his attention was returned to the basic chores at hand. Yet, despite his composed demeanor, there was a slight change in the air. The way the customers treated him, they spoke more respectfully, expressed gratitude, and expressed amazement at the bartender. Deserved appreciation, even if he didn't ask for it. His actions had not only eliminated the threat but also sent a strong message that this pub was a haven and not a place for unbridled aggression or haughtiness. Silent, uncompromising guardian, as the evening drew to a close, the bar returned to its rhythm. The bartender went about his business as usual, and the evening's events seemed to frighten him out of his wits. But the memory of what he had done would stay with those who had witnessed it long after they had left. The guards would also bear the burden of their interaction with them, serving as a reminder that outward appearances can be deceiving and that the bartender's legend did not necessarily quantify power in terms of size or numbers. Also, the term conservative would surely increase after this evening. He neither sought nor did ask for it. He avoided it since, to him, the bee was a haven of calm and a haven from the life he had left behind. But he wouldn't think twice about acting as though there was a threat to the tranquility, as there had been tonight. Everyone who had seen his silent but unquestionable power could see that the returned to its typical rhythm, although there was still a sense of wonder among the customers. Talk started up again, but in a quieter tone. The bartender's presence appeared to have an almost magnetic pull when viewed via a fresh lens. His calm manner made it obvious that he had made a lasting impression on everyone who had seen what happened that evening. Was something much more important than the man behind the counter, but nobody dared to mention it. It was announced that the vanquished guards had departed with more than just wounds. In addition to being a retreat, their leaving was a recognition of their own vulnerability to the leader's haughtiness. Had been so noticeable when they arrived, now carried the burden of his embarrassment. Reluctantly acknowledging that he had come across a force that was beyond his comprehension, silence had spoken volumes. Although customers were happy that the tension had subsided, they couldn't help but wonder what would happen next. The bartender would not overlook the guards' failure because they were influential members of the galaxy's hierarchy, but Dmitri appeared indifferent to the consequences, carrying out his responsibilities with the same taciturn efficiency as before. Displaying no signs of weariness or concern, the crisis was ended and he had completed. It seemed as though he had drawn a line in order to safeguard his customers and preserve the integrity of his establishment. Despite their initial arrogance, the Sand and the guards had comprehended the message and would not, at the very least, return. Not in the same manner that customers exchange curious, speculative whispers. With each second that goes by, the intricacies of the bartender's behavior reveal more and more about who he really is, being expanded and turned into legendary tales. According to some, was a renowned warrior who had retired to pursue peace, as some had urged. Be a protector of equilibrium and an enforcer of some covert galactic order who only showed his power when absolutely required. But the bartender never provided any explanation, either verified or refuted the rumors, enabling them to become independent for the customers of the bartender. His mystique was further enhanced by his quietness, which made him a living example of quiet strength. Even those who had previously questioned him now spoke of him as a legend in their eyes. They spoke of his calm authority in every move and the precision with which he had silenced the guards. And the unwavering assurance that characterized his behavior, even though they were unaware of his past, they sensed its significance. And because of his presence, the incident's account would not be limited to the bar. Knowledge of it traveled swiftly. The story was passed from one person to another and carried by those who wished they had been there. And carried by those who had been there, station to another, expanding with each recounting until the bartender arrived at the bigger galactic hubs. He was more than simply a man. He was a legendary character, a personified embodiment of might and mystery. The story's specifics changed, but one thing stayed the same. Humans had defeated the Galactic Enforcement Center. With seamless precision, the bartender conveyed to everyone who heard the story that none of this mattered. He chose this life to get away from the burdens of his past and create a new life, not to pursue fame or cause fear. The pub served as his sanctuary, a place where he could find some measure of calm in a galaxy that seemed to be on the verge of anarchy all the time. He knew that he could live without the weight of expectations or the continual tug of duty, yet, since peace was ephemeral, he would act without hesitation to preserve it. The remembrance of his acts that evening were a warning to everyone who could jeopardize the equilibrium he was trying to maintain, not just the guards. The bartender couldn't completely escape the world he had left behind, even if he didn't want to go back to it. He couldn't forget that his abilities, reflexes, and unwavering resolve were all relics of a past, of who he was, and they emerged with a clarity and possibility of doubt when the time came. The bar gradually dwindled as the evening went on, and those who had stayed to retell the night's events started to leave a combination of appreciation and respect for the various people who came here. Had transformed the wicked hand, proclaimed it incredential, it can only hours before. Had changed its meaning, becoming more than just a tavern, it was now a location called a haven that had broken out only hours before. Cleaned the counter, moving steadily and deliberately, his thoughts seemed elsewhere, even though the pub was quiet. Thoughts were not the memories of people he couldn't save mixed with the faces of others he had saved. Was a burden he bore by himself, a reminder of the price he paid for decisions he didn't regret, what he had done, but he also didn't feel proud of it, because the events of the night was a necessity rather than a victory, and his strength was a means of preservation rather than a show of dominance. The tranquility he cherished served as a reminder that, despite his decision to live a more subdued life, his inner warrior was never far away. On the surface, that aspect of him that had been developed over years of struggle and loss was both a boon and a bane. The bartender gave himself permission to think for a bit before locking up for the evening. Despite the galaxy's vastness and never-ending difficulties, he managed to find a little niche where he could live in relative seclusion. Yet he was aware that solitude had drawbacks of its own. The tale of what had occurred tonight would have spread, potentially posing new risks. However, he wasn't concerned because he had already encountered much more dangerous situations, and would. Even if it was a quiet night, the bar was his property, so he could use them again if necessary. Of quietude in a galaxy that frequently appeared to be anything but the bartender. Ever vigilant, ever calm, stood as its peace was brittle, frail, but for those who genuinely cared, a silent guardian was ready to shield it from whatever came next. Recognized its significance and that it was worth every expense, the bartender was more knowledgeable than most, and he was willing to cover that expense if necessary.